And welcome back to Pastor Plek's podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Plek, and join me in studio is none other than Holland Gregg, lead pastor from Eastside Community Church. So glad to have you, Holland.
Thanks, Chris.
And then also is Bri Mota, a frequent contributor here to Pastor Plek's podcast, and so glad you're joining us. Welcome.
Hello.
All right, so the big thing that has been going viral on the internet is a video that we just watched, and we will watch it again here for us all to sort of take a look at. And go ahead and play that, Cody. All right, so after watching that video, I'm sort of like in tune, and I would love to hear what we think. Primarily, here's the thing that really stuck out. In JD Vance gave like the ordo amoris. He says, listen, you love your family, then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. This perspective suggests that one's immediate responsibilities to family, neighbors, and community should take precedence before extending concern to broader global matters. Now, this has caused a lot of people to get angry. Give me some of the anger that you've seen pour over the internet, Holland.
Yep, I've seen. I think just as important to note too, anger is not just like people outside of the church.
Yeah.
But even within the church, a lot of evangelical leaders heard that statement, made a lot of posts on social media about why it was wrong, why it's a total rejection of the heart of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus and things like that. And so, like Thabiti Anyabwile is one of someone who is really connected with like 9 Marks and kind of formerly I think kind of had a reputation as like a conservative pastor and preacher and theologian who's really kind of drifted way more to the liberal side of things. And I don't know, the last few years is what it seems that I've noticed. And he's one of the people who made a comment of just like, man, this JD Vance gets it totally wrong here. And so a lot of pastors, theologians, evangelical leaders have had a lot of issues with what JD Vance said.
When you hear that, Bri, just as woman off the street, like, what is your natural reaction to what JD Vance said of essentially you go, you love your family, then you love your neighbor, then you love your community, then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that you focus on the rest of the world?
To me, I thought that was common sense.
Okay. So that sounds like common sense. Now, sometimes...
On that note, well, can I say something?
Yeah.
So on that note, you mentioned ordo amoris, which is, he doesn't say that phrase in the clip.
Right.
But he quoted it in a response to someone like pushing back on the clip. And he said his response to this person, well, I'll read what the person said first. This is Rory Stewart, UK leader. And he said, this is a bizarre take on John 15, less Christian and more pagan, tribal. We should start worrying when politicians become theologians, assumed to speak for Jesus and tell us in which order to love. And then JD Vance replied, just Google ordo amoris, which is pretty funny. But, he says, just Google this. And then he said, aside from that, the idea that there isn't a hierarchy of obligations violates basic common sense, to your point. And then he says, does Rory really think his moral duties to his own children are the same as his duties to a stranger who lives thousands of miles away? Does anyone? So he appeals to common sense and ordo amoris, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but it is a classic Christian teaching,
right?
That all people, I think, intuitively recognize. That's the common sense part, but a lot of Christian theologians have written about and taught on, and so from guys like Augustine to Thomas Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, Herman Bavinck, Calvin, there's writings about this order of and hierarchy of loves and priorities and duties. People have written on all throughout Christian history. So,
right. So I feel like it does get. I just want to look at the scripture because sometimes, like when you look at scripture, sometimes it goes against the grain of culture. And so here is the elected vice president got majority of all the votes. So here is the majority person, leader of the country, not a minority voice speaking. And sometimes when the majority speaks, then the church needs to speak into that to correct that which is wrong. And I think we have voices now trying to correct it, but let's just kind of go with that. I think the first verse for me that sticks out, and maybe, we can kind of all just start here. 1 Timothy 5:8 for me kind of really, if he who doesn't take care of his own family is worse than an unbeliever. Like, that's sort of wild. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially a member of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so I don't know. And again, this is for Christians. And so here's what Christians should do. Take care of your own specific family. Now, JD Vance sort of makes that case that Christians should take care of their own family. Now, JD Vance, not that he shouldn't be concerned about families. He is obviously concerned about families. He, as a ruler, is supposed to put the people of his nation first, and he doesn't bear the sword for nothing. And so I feel like that is his bringing justice and provision and providing for his own nation before he looks after the justice of other nations is the priority of rulers in accordance with like a Romans 13 sort of mindset. Would you agree with that, or am I going out of bounds, you think?
Yeah, no, totally agree. And, the principle, 1 Timothy 5:8, he says, if anyone doesn't provide for his relatives, especially members of his own household, the word especially there means you have a special type of obligation or duty that is related to and in proportion to your love for it. Your love should be greatest for your family, your household. And there are obligations that go with that love. And he says, if you don't do this, you're worse than an unbeliever. Why? Because even unbelievers, many of them understand by virtue of common sense that this is what you're supposed to do. To not do that is worse than an unbeliever, because some of the pushback has been like, that's not a Christian teaching.
Right.
Everybody knows that. But then he says, you've also denied the faith. So there's actually there's a way that it is of the faith, of the Christian faith to do this. It's God's will. It is right and approved of by God to have ordered loves and special love for certain people. And so we know that as a family. Throughout church history, nations have been understood essentially as, similar to, rulers of nations have been called like the fathers of nations. There's a familial aspect to it. It's not the same. You have the three institutions of the family, the state, and the church. And so a nation state is not the same as a family, but there's similar principles involved in that the rulers of a nation state are responsible for the well-being of the people under their care. And they've been given the sword, like you say. His job is to ensure justice, promote what is good, punish what is evil. And so to prioritize your nation and the needs of your nation, the good of your nation, is a totally Christian thing. It's something that even unbelievers, many, understand.
Right.
But it is also of the Christian faith to think in that kind of way.
All right, I'm going to give you another verse, and I want you to kind of weigh in. Galatians 6:10. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone. And as to that word you said a second ago, especially to those who are of the household of faith. So, in other words, put Christians above non-Christians. Those within the household of faith, those within the governing structure of the church should be ministered to in priority over those who are outside the household of faith. And then you would think that same sort of concept would be a natural concept within the governing structure of a nation. Those under those whom the ruler is responsible to God for. Like, I think this is where sometimes you just said it. There's three governing authorities: the state, the church, and the family. And the state is responsible before God, separate of the church, for the way that they conduct itself in its governance of its people. And if it prioritizes people that it's not responsible for over the ones it is responsible for, then that becomes problematic.
Yes, exactly.
So anyway, I feel like I don't know if there is, let's just go to some Bible verse that people might go to. I think it's like, bless your enemies.
Okay.
Like, love your enemies. Is that where we're going with?
So there's a few. I think some of the pushback from it is, well, I think a lot of the pushback comes from people's inability or failure to think in different categories.
Right.
That how a nation establishes its policies is not the exact same as how an individual person, shows mercy to people who are in need or something
Right.
like that. So like churches, nation states, families can embody the love of God in different ways, right? And that's going to look different depending on what the institution, what the particular situation is. But so some of the pushback, I think, is coming from that root of not thinking in the right categories, but also in just, I think it's mainly an appeal to compassion and saying, okay, aren't we supposed to love our enemy? Aren't we supposed to love the stranger? Aren't we supposed to love the foreigner? And so the answer is yes, we are supposed to do all those things. But love, you can love two people genuinely and sincerely, and yet the way that you treat them does not have to be the same thing, right?
Right.
So this, I'll quote Augustine, where we get the idea of ordo amoris, that phrase. He says, one ought to love all men equally. So we can say we love all people equally. But then he says, since, however, one cannot do good to all, we ought to consider those chiefly who, by reason of place, time, or any other circumstance, by a kind of chance, are more closely united to us. So he says, okay, we can love all people equally in some sense of the word love, and yet in another sense of how we practically love them, it's not going to be the same. For instance, you can't buy dinner for every hungry person in the world tonight, but you can for one.
Right.
And so does that mean that you don't love all people equally? Well, in a sense, yes. In another sense, no. Because you love all people the same, you will buy dinner for that one person. But also, you can't love everyone the exact same because you can't buy dinner for everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. So recently, so in January 28th of 25, the U.S. State Department expanded exemptions to the aid suspension. And so they said to cover humanitarian programs, life-saving medicine, but it would get rid of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, ideology programs, transgender surgery, and non-life-saving assistance. And so I think what happened is people got upset that any cuts were being made at all. And what the administration was doing is saying, like, we are not for the diversity, equity, inclusion. We are not for abortion. We are not for transgender surgeries. And so we are going to cut those programs. Or like, I think there was one that was like $70,000 to create a musical in Ireland that was advancing transgenderism. And so they cut that. And you're like, why are taxpayers from the United States spending money on a $70,000 musical for transgenderism? Or that to me was wild when I read about that, found out about that. And so I think a lot of these cost-cutting measures are actually really healthy. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't use U.S. aid to create stability throughout different theaters of operation and create goodwill between the United States and those abroad. However, I do think prioritizing our own country, and when there are those in North Carolina or in Los Angeles who've gone through natural disasters and they're struggling to rebuild their homes and rebuild their lives, priority should be put on your own people as opposed to foreign aid. And I think that's what they were trying to get around. And so I do think that's the right answer. Like those rebuilding their homes in California and North Carolina need the help or maybe say first before you give help to those in foreign countries.
Yeah, exactly. Because JD, the way JD Vance said it, he said, it doesn't mean we hate anyone.
Right.
And he said, he didn't say you never help anyone
right
outside of your own country. But he said there's an order, of priorities. And so what you just described, yeah, like you've got to take care. And the reality is, if you do a really good job taking care of your own country, you're going to be poised to be of help to others.
Right.
Whereas if you don't prioritize the health, safety, security, prosperity of your own country, you will eventually collapse from the inside, and you won't be able to be of any good to anyone.
I think this is funny because I think every person that's criticizing this has heard the saying on an airplane,
Put your own
mask
yeah.
on first.
I was
before
just
you
gonna
help
say
others.
that.
I mean, I
Exactly.
don't think there's
Yeah.
one person that's going like, nah, that's dumb. You better put your mask on your kid first. Well, while you're putting the mask on the kid, you pass out. Well, that's not going to help that kid out at all because that kid can't function. That kid can't help you. He can't do anything. And so you've got to prioritize your own health before you then prioritize the health of even your own child. And that is the best thing for that child. Likewise, it is the best thing for the free world when the strongest nation takes care of its strength, mobilizes it, helps those in need within its own borders, and then can go forth. And again, I like that. It's not that we don't help those outside the United States. In fact, I think we do.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to be a nation that is prosperous and that is a blessing to other people.
And
but you can't get there by continually debilitating yourself by prioritizing those outside. You know, while you're suffering on the inside. So while we're in trillions of dollars of debt, while we have some of the situations you just explained, to take care of yourself first allows you to be able to be in a position to take care of and help others.
Yeah. What other pushback do you think people would give to that? Because I'm trying to make like a legitimate. I want to hear the other side of the argument. I just have a hard time getting there on. And I guess I would go with maybe love your enemies, do good, and lend. Expect nothing in return, and your world will be great, and you'll be called sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Or if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you heap burning coals on his head. Or how about, but I say to you, this is Luke 6:27, I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And we have been doing good to those who hate us. We've been giving aid to those who are actively trying to kill us for years. And I think sometimes that might be what's been sustaining the evil that's been going on is our own aid. And I don't think it's helping us. I don't think it's, pushing back darkness. In fact, I think it's helping to perpetuate something that needs to be ultimately stopped. What are you thinking there, Bri?
I mean, to me, through all of this, my one question I would ask someone who disagrees is, if you are struggling to pay your light bill and your husband is giving all your money to a married woman down the street, how would you feel?
Right.
I'm sure you'd be jealous. I'm sure you'd be ticked off. I'm sure your marriage would not be strong. So why is it any different with our country?
Right.
Or if your pastor is handing out all this money and your church is falling apart, or our benevolence, like, yes, we are helping the community, but if a member applies
and we're like, oh, sorry, this money needs to go,
like,
really need
there is priority. And yes, with the overflow, we bless those around us. Again, those around us, you're not going over to another.
Even in our own church, our benevolence priority is members first.
Yes.
Members first, then regular attenders, then people who live in the neighborhood, and then extended beyond, because we want to be a light in the dark for them. That's a great point. And so I think that's where, the people that we should be supporting first, probably Mexico and Canada, since there are two neighbors, which ironically I think is just who Trump made a business deal with. And we aren't going to tariff them. I think both of them said, hey, no tariffs, and we'll stop the flow.
I think it's a 30-day pause.
30-day pause.
To assess how things go or something like that.
Right. And so I think that's sort of wild that you're having to negotiate with neighbors, but you have to do this with your own neighbors. Like, I've had to have, arguments or, moments with my own neighbors to kind of like, hey, keep the volume down when you have your Bible studies late at night. Cause we go wild at my house. And we had to have some concessions, I sent gifts to create a bond of peace between my neighbor, because I think that's super important, because I value my neighbor. And I think we need to be doing that. But when it comes down to valuing across the, several neighborhoods over to a street there, it's good. I don't think it's bad, but I should first take care of those closest to me, because that seems like that makes common sense.
Yeah. And people have, some of the pushback, people have cited like the Good Samaritan story as like, oh, look, this is someone it was a Samaritan helping, someone. And we're assuming the guy beaten up on the side of the road was an Israelite. And we don't really, it never says, right?
It says, I think it does say.
It does say?
Yeah.
So the idea there is that like, okay, they're different, ethnicities, nationalities. They're not, kinsmen in a sense. And yet he takes care of that guy. So like, doesn't that disprove it? He's taking care a Samaritan taking care of an Israelite. And so people have brought that up to say like, oh, that's not like my country first or whatever. But I think it just really proves the whole point of like, this was someone who was his neighbor in the sense of he's right here, someone that he could help with his own money.
Right.
That like, if he were to see the man beat up, left for dead on the side of the road and say, I can't help you because I'm sending my money across, the other side of the world or whatever, to people that I don't see, that I don't have proximity with, that I'm not whatever. And so I can't help you who's right here.
And in that story, Jesus is shaming the religious leaders who did not prioritize their own.
Yeah.
They did the exact thing that we're talking about. They said no to helping the one that was their own kinsman or their own nation because it was inconvenient. They were afraid, whatever the reason was, we don't know. But it was something that everyone assumed a priest or a Levite would take care of his own countrymen. That was sort of their literal job. And then when a Samaritan has to do it, it is shameful to them. And I think that's the whole point of that story, is what God's saying is because you're missing the whole point of the gospel, I first come to the Jews. And then I'm going to go beyond.
There's an order.
You guys have rejected. There was an order. Even in God's expression of his love of Christ, of salvation, it first came to the Jews. And I'm not upset by that. I'm not sitting there going like, how come I got second? I had to stand behind the Jews in line to receive my salvation. Well, clearly it was ordered that way because salvation is from the Jews. Jesus said that to the Samaritan woman who's like, confused about her own religion. It's like, hey, listen, salvation is from the Jews. It is priority first. And Paul went first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. And so I think all throughout the scripture, you have a hierarchy of relationship, a hierarchy of priority. And because if you don't have a hierarchy of priority, then you have chaos. You have complete anarchy. You have kind of like do whatever you want to do with whomever you want to do it. Because we would say our intimacy, our love, our finances has a hierarchy of priority, and it should go to our family. If you're like a person that in your will you give it all to a foreign country and you leave your family that's out of it that's in desperate need, you would say you are messed up. You would say you did not take care of
You're
your
worse
family.
than an unbeliever.
You're worse
and you've
than an
denied the faith. That's
In
what
fact-
1 Timothy 5.
And Jesus criticized Jews for this. Remember Corbin?
Corbin
Said, like, you say, I'm giving all of this to God, and so I can't help my mom and my dad. Whereas Jesus, look, you are obliterating the fourth command, the fifth commandment, just so that you can say, I'm honoring God. And by the way you honor God is by honoring those who loved you first.
Yeah,
so I
the
think
fifth commandment is an example too. It doesn't say honor everyone. It says honor your mother and father. Yes, we do honor everyone, but there is a greater degree of honor.
Yeah.
Herman Bavinck says this way, the command to show love toward everyone does not preclude different degrees of that love. Some people are much closer to us than others. Some are bound to us by a physical relationship, social political relations, spiritual unity, or by friendship and the like. Aquinas says this, wherefore, in matters pertaining to nature, we should love our kindred most. In matters concerning relations between citizens, we should prefer our fellow citizens. And on the battlefield, our fellow soldiers. So like, should you love your enemy? Yes, you should. But that looks different for someone who is a soldier in a war. What does it look like to love your enemy and, to be a soldier who's faithful to your mission and stuff like that? Right. And you got to prioritize and prefer your fellow soldiers in a way. And so understanding there's different categories to apply what love looks like, and there's different degrees of love, I think really helps you actually think through this thing. It's not saying you need to hate everyone, reject people, don't ever help someone. No, as Christians, we should love our enemies. We should love the foreigner, the poor. But what that looks like and, how we practically do that, there's an actual rational and biblical order and approach to it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like, so yeah, I feel like, to me, this is such a, I don't know. I think it's common sense, and in a world that's lost common sense, I feel like it's wild, to look at how we've lost reality, and we need to kind of get back into understanding the ordo amoris. Now, I will say, when it comes to combatants, like when enemy and friendly, you treat the most wounded first, which is so it doesn't matter if it's like, if you've got a friendly that has a broken arm and an enemy with a chest sucking wound, or chest, like they're dying out, bleeding out, you treat that guy first, and then you handle the broken arm guy. It doesn't matter whose side they're on. But ultimately, if they're equal, if everything's equal, you choose your own country first, because that's just what you do. So,
yeah,
anyway.
There you go.
There's
order, logic, reason, and that's not a way to escape love or duty. It's a way to best love.
Yeah.
Right? That's the whole point of that, is not like, I think that's what some of the pushback is assuming, is that like, oh, this ordo amoris is a way to kind of neglect obligations to certain people.
Right.
But rather it's how to best love others with the limited resources that you have.
And if people would say, hey, the rest of the world has a sucking chest wound and the United States only has a broken arm, then I could say, okay, that's where you're getting your argument from. But I don't think they're saying that. They're saying, what they are saying is, you need to prioritize the other people first. And I think that's what this administration is doing differently. They're securing borders first to take care of its own people first, which I think is the government's first responsibility, responsible to God for that in the the three different leadership structures of the world.
Yeah.
Man, I think we pretty much solved it. Any other thoughts on that, Miss Mota?
Nope.
Yeah. I just think taking it to your own house is it's not a perfect analogy, but you just go, do I want my household to help people outside of my household? Yes, but not to the point where it hurts the people in my household and keeps them from having what they need.
Right.
And so can I open my home up to some people for a place to stay or to have a meal to eat? Yes. But if I just say, okay, anyone can come in and do whatever they want, whenever they want, like that's going to lead to the collapse of my household, to where I can't help anyone anymore. Yeah. And so having order and structure and things is not to be hateful to others. It's to preserve the ability to love and bless others well. So I think that's what, like, in my heart, I want people to understand, is like the purpose of it is to be able to bless other people even more.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for watching. From our house to yours, have an awesome week of worship.